Good morning, everyone.
In unison, good morning.
In unison, good morning, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. The people call Dave Saunders as their next witness.
Come forward, please. When you get to the witness stand, remain standing. Face the clerk over here and raise your right hand.
Yes, ma'am.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
My name is David Saunders. Saunders.
Thank you.
Good morning. Would you please tell the jury how you're employed and what your position is?
Yes, I'm the Chief Criminal Investigator for the District Attorney's Office.
How long have you held that position?
About 2.5 years.
And prior to that, did you have other law enforcement experience?
Yes, I've been a peace officer for about 19 years.
Turning your attention to this case, were you asked to assist Sergeant Bonner and Detective Zelis in the analysis of certain phone records contained in telephone binders to my left and in front of you?
Yes.
Were you assigned the dates of March 2nd, 3rd and 4th of 2003?
Yes.
If you could turn your attention to Exhibit 872, please.
Okay.
Do you recognize that exhibit?
Yes.
And could you tell the jury what that exhibit is?
Yeah. This is a diagram showing the relevant telephone calls involved in this matter on March 2, 2003.
And if you can flip to Exhibit 873.
Yes.
Is that the diagram for March 3rd of 2003?
Yes.
And Exhibit 874, please.
Yes. That's the diagram for the 4th.
Now, behind each of the diagrams marked 872, 873 and 874, are there spreadsheets which contain the actual phone calls?
Yes, there are.
Okay. And are those accurate?
Yes.
Did you physically connect the phone calls that are listed on that chart to the evidence in the telephone binders that we've previously discussed?
Yes. On the spreadsheet for each row, each one, I manually checked and compared it to the exhibit to confirm the accuracy.
Okay. And do Exhibits 872, 873 and 874 accurately reflect the analysis that you conducted?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time we'd offer those 3 exhibits into evidence.
No further objection. We have the objection to tying these up, but other than that.
All right, they're admitted.
If you could turn to the chart for Exhibit 872, please. And, Your Honor, if I may have, input 4 on the Elmo. Is that the diagram chart for Sunday, March 2nd of 2003?
Yes.
If you could please start in the upper left-hand corner and tell us when the call between the Frank Cascio phone and the Evie Tavashi home phone occurred.
Your Honor, I'm going to object and also move under 352. The objection being the documents speak for themselves. There's been inadequate foundation, and 352, undue consumption of time going through each call.
All right, that's overruled. Go ahead.
The call between Mr. Cascio and Ms. Tavashi occurred at 6:04 p.m. and lasted 2 minutes or less.
Okay. And generally, can you give us a time frame between the Casio phone and the icon marked Evelyn Tavashi, MJJ Productions?
Yes, the calls occurred between 6:03 p.m. and 6:15 p.m.
Okay. And if you could direct your attention to the bottom middle icon, the one that's marked Paul Hugo. And I've placed in front of you Exhibit 453. If you could open that up, please. Are the telephone records for that Paul Hugo phone contained within Exhibit 453 at tab number 3?
Yes, sir.
Do the records indicate where the calls from the Paul Hugo phone originated on March 2nd of 2003?
Yes, Brazil.
And can you tell us which page you're looking at in that exhibit?
Yes, sir, it's page 8 of 12, as well as page 9 of 12.
I'm going to put page 9 of 12 up on the screen briefly. I've highlighted a line in there. Based on your review of the records, what can you tell us about the call that is highlighted up on the Elmo?
Mr. Hugo checked his voicemail at 10:32 a.m., Brazil time, and he was in Brazil when he did so.
And Brazil is 5 hours ahead of the Pacific coast?
Yes.
So that's 5:32 a.m., California time, correct?
That's right.
Is that the first call that you see in the Paul Hugo records?
Yes, sir.
Coming from Brazil?
Yes.
Now, with respect to the calls, I'll put it back up. Between the Paul Hugo phone and the Vincent Amen phone, what time was the first call placed from Brazil to the Vincent Amen phone?
6:05 p.m., Brazil time.
Okay. How long did that call last?
3 minutes or less.
Immediately after that call to the Vincent Amen phone from the Paul Hugo phone, was there a call from the Frank Cassio phone to the Vince Amen phone?
Yes.
How long was that call?
1 minute or less.
And immediately after the call between the Frank Cassio phone to the Vince Amen phone, was there also a call that's not on this chart from the Frank Cassio phone to the Paul Hugo phone?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to put that on the chart. I believe this is page 8 of the Paul Hugo phone records, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And were you able to confirm which of these calls was the call between the Frank Cassio phone to the Paul Hugo phone?
Yes, it's the one item, number 3.
And that call lasted for 8 minutes?
That's right.
The additional calls on this record, specifically call 4 and call 9, do you recognize the phone numbers associated with those calls being dialed out from Brazil?
Yes, that's Vincent Amen's.
Okay, and with respect to call number 7 and 8, do you recognize those phone numbers? Are they on your chart for Marc Schaffel?
Yes, thank you, yes.
Now, before we finish with the Paul Hugo phone record, I'd like to show you page 11 of 12. Just briefly, is that page 11 of 12?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm not going to project it, but while you're testifying, can you tell us whether that call item contained within the Paul Hugo phone records was the last call that you see from Brazil?
It was.
And without telling us the actual phone number, do you know from your review of the records where that call was placed to?
The defendant's home.
Neverland Valley Ranch?
Yes, sir.
And that call lasted for how long?
2 minutes or less.
Okay, if we could turn to Exhibit 873, please. And if I may use the Elmo again, Your Honor. Is that the chart for Monday, March 3rd of 2003?
Yes.
And at the right-hand corner of the chart, if you would focus on the calls labeled, Vincent Amen, and, Neverland Valley Ranch. If you could give us the time range that those calls occurred between those two phones.
The first call was at 3:17 p.m. and the last call was at 6:49 p.m.
And the same question with respect to the calls between the Frank Cassio phone and the Neverland Valley Ranch phone.
The first call was at 1:34 p.m. The last call was at 8:28 p.m.
The calls between Neverland Valley Ranch and the marker marked, Evelyn Tavashi, MJJ Production, was that call? Excuse me, was the phone number for the Evelyn Tavashi line that you have up there 402-7087, area code, 818?
Yes.
Were all the calls in that linked to that particular phone?
Yes.
If we could turn, please, to the next exhibit, 874. If we could start with the Paul Hugo telephone line, I'd ask you whether the calls between the Paul Hugo line and the Vince Amen line were in one direction or whether the calls were going both ways.
They were in one direction.
And which direction was that?
Mr. Hugo was calling Mr. Amen.
And are the calls being placed from the Paul Hugo phone in Brazil?
Yes, sir.
The next link would be from Paul Hugo phone to Marc Schaffel phone. Were those also all initiated by the Paul Hugo phone?
Yes.
Can you tell us what time the first call between the Hugo phone and the Amen phone first came in?
Yes.
Please do so.
1 a.m., Brazil time.
Okay, and with respect to the calls between Paul Hugo phone and Marc Schaffel phone, can you tell us what time that first call came in?
1:12 p.m., Brazil time.
Did the calls between the Vince Amen phone and the Neverland Valley Ranch phone go both directions or one direction?
One direction.
Was there a call placed from the Vince Amen phone to Neverland Valley Ranch at 13:07 p.m.?
Yes.
And did that follow a call, excuse me, was that the first call to Neverland Valley Ranch by Vince Amen's phone?
Yes.
And the other two calls were at 4:14 and 2:34 p.m.?
Yes, sir.
If you could turn your attention to the Frank Cassio phone.
Okay.
Were all the phone calls from the Frank Cassio phone inbound to Neverland Valley Ranch?
Yes.
And what time was the first call?
9:05 a.m.
And how long did that call last?
7 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chief Investigator. I have no more questions.
May I proceed?
Yes.
Investigator Saunders, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Why don't you leave those there, please? Those are the originals?
These are my copies.
Oh, the originals are up there. Sorry. Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm sorry. Alright, I'm going to ask you to clarify one thing, first of all. And we're going to put these exhibits up quickly. You said, your testimony was, that a call was placed by Paul Hugo to the defendant's home. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
Okay, you were out there at the search on November 18, 2003, were you not, sir?
That's correct.
And you're aware that what you refer to as the defendant's home is, in fact, 2,700 acres, is that correct?
Yes.
And you're aware that not only is there a large home, but there are a number of outbuildings, is that correct?
That's right.
And there is approximately 100 people who are employed at that ranch, is that correct?
I don't know if there are 100 people employed.
How many, what's your best estimate, having been out there?
That's beyond the scope of my knowledge. I really don't know how many employees he has.
Let's just put it this way. You know that there are dozens and dozens of people who work out there. How about that?
That's a fair assessment.
Alright, and do you know how many telephone extensions there are out there?
I know there are multiple telephone extensions. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head.
Now, when you did the phone analysis, you evaluated how many telephone numbers, in other words, distinct telephone numbers for Neverland Valley Ranch.
For the 3 dates in question, I'd have to go back and look at each date to add them up, but there were multiple numbers.
Okay, are there at least 8 distinct telephone numbers?
No, I don't think there are that many.
During the period you looked at about 4 of them, is that right?
That sounds more accurate, yes.
Were you aware that there were more than the 4 numbers that you looked at?
Yes.
And then in addition to telephone numbers, I'd ask you about extensions. In other words, physical telephones located different places. And you don't know how many physical telephones are located in different places on the ranch, do you?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that question?
Well, when I said extensions, I wanted to clarify we're talking about. There's phone numbers and then there are actual telephones. You can have more telephones than extensions, I take it?
Sure.
And so do you know how many actual telephone extensions there were throughout that ranch?
No.
Would you say dozens?
I'm not qualified to comment on how many there are.
Well, you were. You were out there during the search, and you looked around, right?
No, I didn't look around. I was at the command post.
Were you in the house?
No, I was at the command post.
I'm sorry?
I was at the command post.
You were out on the front porch of the house for a while?
Right.
You're in the photographs of the search, right?
I haven't seen my photographs.
Okay, and then where did you go to? Where is the command post?
It was parked in front of the residence.
Okay, so you were outside. The command post was the big van, or the big motorhome.
Motorhome looking thing.
You didn't stay inside the whole time on November 18, 2003, did you?
Inside the mobile home?
Right.
No, sir.
Alright, and it's your testimony you did not go into any of the buildings, any of the structures anywhere?
Objection, Your Honor, this is beyond the scope.
Overruled.
At one point, I went in to get some of my personnel to check on them, and that was a fairly isolated incident.
Alright, in any event, your understanding is that there was certainly several telephone extensions on that ranch, let us say that.
Yes.
And do you know who was at the ranch, which employees were at the ranch, on March 2, 2003?
Personal knowledge or what the investigation has indicated?
Well, start with personal knowledge.
No.
You know there were employees there, correct?
Yes.
Alright, and you were there at the search as a representative of the district attorney's office, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Sneddon himself was there during part of the search, correct?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Alright, in any event, you saw other district attorney's employees besides yourself there at the search, correct?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Sustained.
So when you said Paul Hugo, the phone call went to the defendant's home.
Uh-huh.
You have no idea who made the call, first of all, Paul Hugo's phone, right? You have no idea who placed the call from his phone, correct?
I'd say it's a reasonable inference that he did. I wasn't there and didn't witness it.
Move to strike based on speculation.
It's a question you asked. Counsel. I'm not going to restrict him.
It's not responsive if it's.
That's responsive. You have no idea. Well, he has an idea.
Alright, very well, Your Honor. Beyond the fact that if somebody's phone is in their name, you could speculate that they may have been the person using it. Beyond that, from these records, can you determine who placed the call from Paul Hugo's phone?
No.
Now, more importantly, with regard to the Neverland Valley Ranch, can you determine from the phone records who answered the phone, if anybody, at Neverland Valley Ranch when the call was made?
From the phone records?
Right.
No.
Alright, and can you tell us from the phone records? Let me withdraw that. I asked you about the employees at the ranch on March the 2nd, 2003. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you said that there were employees. Your understanding was that there were employees there, you just don't know who. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now, were there other people there, guests, or people associated with business or music, or some other connection? Were there other people at the ranch besides employees on March the 2nd, 2003? Do you know?
There were many people there. I don't know what their role was specifically. There were employees. There were some young boys, and there were some other people but.
On March the 2nd, 2003?
We're talking about the day of the search warrant?
No. We're talking about March the 2nd, 2003.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You testified to March the 2nd.
Yes, sir. I see. You're right. I'm sorry. I don't know who was there.
Alright, now, when did you prepare 872, the chart that was put up on the board? In fact, Your Honor, while asking that question, I'd like to approach and retrieve that exhibit, if I may put it up.
You may.
Thank you.
That was finalized yesterday morning.
Alright, you can leave it in the book for a moment. Mr. Nicola has given me his copy of this, which purports to be the same thing. May I put that up?
You may.
It's 872. Alright, now, you had just indicated this was finalized yesterday morning, this particular summary chart.
Yes, sir.
Which is 872, for the record. And on that chart, you do not record some of these telephone calls that you referred to, is that correct, in your testimony?
Yes, there was a call between, an outgoing call from Mr. Cassio.
Okay, I didn't ask you about, to detail them. Because there were several, were there not? You referred to a call from Cassio, a call from Hugo to Neverland Valley Ranch, at least two of them, is that correct?
I'd object. It misstates the evidence with respect to Neverland Valley Ranch.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
That's not what I recall. That call between Hugo and Neverland Valley was when Hugo was leaving Brazil, and I believe that was a later date than the second.
What date was that?
Let me look back into the records and.
Well, that's all right. It's in the records.
Your Honor, I'd request the witness be allowed to answer that question.
He asked permission to go through the records and.
I have it now.
If he has it, then we'll ask.
All right.
What date was it?
March 8th.
March 8th. Okay, so that would not have anything to do with the March 2nd call, the March 2nd chart for 872, correct?
Correct.
Alright, now, there's one page attached to 872, the first page of which we have on the board, right? You have one page.
There's one page, yes, sir.
And it's not a full page, correct? Alright, it looks like you have more on your page than I do on mine. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
On page 2 of 872 that you have that's been admitted into evidence, you have a number of calls from Mr. Hugo which are added on to the analysis. Is that correct?
They're included in the analysis, yes, sir.
When were they added on?
I don't have an independent recollection when they were added on. I know I was working on this through the weekend, confirming that everything was completely accurate. And I believe they were there at that time.
Alright, now, as far as Mr. Hugo is concerned, in the course of your investigation in this case, you were aware that Mr. Hugo was a production associate of Marc Schaffel, correct?
Objection. Lack of foundation. Calls for hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
Would you please repeat the question?
Ask. Your Honor, if it may be read back.
Yes.
All right, now, as far as Mr. Hugo is concerned, in the course of your investigation in this case, you were aware that Mr. Hugo was a production associate of Marc Schaffel, correct?
No.
Were you aware that Mr. Hugo had worked with Marc Schaffel in any capacity?
Objection. Lack of foundation, Your Honor.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes, generally.
Alright, and you were aware that at this time Marc Schaffel had traveled commercially to Brazil, is that correct?
No.
Okay, alright, with the court's permission, I'll put up.
My apologies. Laughter.
I think you.
Are we to go to our corners now?
You said the magic word. Laughter.
Sorry, I stole the court's line.
You did.
Yours was probably funnier, I'll acknowledge that. I would like to put 873 up, if I may. Is that all right, Your Honor?
Yes, of course.
And I'm using the copy just provided to me by the district attorney, so if you'd be kind enough to take a look at your 873 and make sure that we are literally and figuratively on the same page here.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I don't want to spend unnecessary time on this, but you notice in your analysis of the phone records here that there are several telephone numbers that were associated with Evelyn Tavashi?
Yes.
In other words, there is the one you've labeled, MJJ Production, there's one, Evelyn, MJJ Prod, Unit 1, there's one, Evelyn Tavashi Home, and there's one, Evelyn Tavashi, MJJ Production, at the bottom. Do you see that on the chart? Do we have our
Yes.
Do we have our pointer, please?
Oh.
Thank you. There's a technical term for this. The pointer thing. There we go. Just so we're clear. I think everybody is, but just in case, we have this one that says, MJJ Production.
Right.
And this one says, MJJ Production, also. But those are, in fact, two different phone numbers, is that correct?
Yes.
The first one at the top ends in 9239, correct?
Let me double check that. That's correct.
And this one ends in 8984, correct?
Yes.
And then there's another one over here that says, Tavashi, Evelyn, MJJ Production, and that's yet another phone which, in fact, is a different area code and ends in 7087, correct?
Yes.
All of these phones that we referred to that say, Tavashi, and have some designation after them, sometimes the same, all of these 5 phones are different phone numbers, right?
That's right.
And they're either 310 or 818, which is the Los Angeles area, is that correct?
Yes.
And then you have this other phone down here, MJJ Production, Miko Brando, which is yet a different number, is that right?
That's right.
Now, in essence, you have somebody in various places here. Without going into excessive detail, you've got somebody on one Evelyn Tavashi phone calling somebody else on another Evelyn Tavashi phone, correct?
Right.
Now, you speculated before, so I'll let you do it again, if it's all right. Do you therefore assume it's not Evelyn Tavashi calling herself on the various phones?
That's a good point. Thanks for giving me a little latitude here. I think that example down at the bottom, the 7 calls going to Neverland, for example, I know that's Chris Carter calling the ranch, and based on.
I didn't ask you if it was Chris Carter calling the ranch. I asked you about these. I didn't say anything you want. I was asking about these calls. You assume that it is not Evelyn Tavashi calling Evelyn Tavashi, that in fact there are other people calling.
Right.
On those phones?
Right.
Alright, okay, alright, and I have no further questions.
No questions.
All right, thank you. You may step down. Call your next witness.
Lieutenant Klapakis, Your Honor.
You may be seated. You're still under oath.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Are you familiar with the telephone number area code 310-490-0144?
Yes, I am.
And did you make a telephone call to that particular phone number?
Yes, I did.
When did you do that?
Yesterday morning.
And when you made that telephone call, let me go back for just a second. During the course of this investigation, have you had an occasion to contact a private investigator by the name of Brad Miller?
Yes, I have.
Do you remember when the first time you contacted Mr. Miller was?
It was 2004.
And you had a conversation with him at that time?
Yes, I believe we did.
Was it a personal call or was it a telephone call?
It was a personal call. We were trying to locate him to deliver some paperwork and stuff like that, so.
And were you able to make contact with him?
Yes.
Now, with regard to the telephone number that you called, it's area code 310-490-0144. You called that number yesterday?
Yes, I did.
And did you talk to somebody on the other line?
Yes, I did.
Who was that?
Brad Miller.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. Miller, without going into the details of what was said?
Yes, I did.
Were you satisfied that the person on the other end of that line was Mr. Miller?
Yes, I am.
Based on both the first conversation earlier in 2004 and the content of the conversation yesterday?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Any questions?
I'm sorry?
Nothing further.
Okay. Lieutenant Klapakis, how are you doing?
Fine, sir.
You've been on this case since June or July of 2003, correct?
Actually, I believe it was prior to that. February of 2003.
You've been on this case since February of 2003?
Yes.
And you were aware of Brad Miller's existence in this case since what time?
Prior to November 2003.
And you say that because, among other things, you all got a search warrant for Brad Miller's office before November 18, 2003, correct?
We obtained a search warrant before November 18. Yes, we did.
And you were aware that Brad Miller was a private investigator before November 18, 2003, correct?
Yes.
In part, Mr. Sneddon himself went to Brad Miller's office before November 18, 2003, to investigate and take photographs, correct?
Mr. Sneddon's been by there. Yes, that's correct.
Did he go down to investigate and take photographs?
He went down to take photographs of the office, yes.
And he looked in the phone book to see if he had the correct address for Mr. Miller, correct?
You know, I'm not sure if he looked in the phone book, sir.
He wrote a report, right?
Do you have the report? It would refresh my memory.
Somewhere.
All right.
It's a fair question, but I don't have it right in front of me. In any event, and Mr. Sneddon actually went down and showed photographs of Brad Miller to Janet Arvizo before the November 18, 2003, search, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And then you had officers search Mr. Miller's office in Beverly Hills on November 18, 2003, correct?
That's correct.
And they went through, to a certain extent, his papers, records, and files within the scope of the search warrant, correct?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as immaterial and irrelevant. Beyond the scope.
Sustained.
All right. It's your testimony that the first time you figured out Brad Miller's phone number was yesterday?
Object as argumentative.
Overruled. You may answer.
No, we believed it was, from other sources, we believed it to be Brad Miller's phone.
When did you first believe it was Brad Miller's phone?
I believe that we were aware it was Mr. A phone that was linked to Mr. Miller through other documents we had found through the various search warrants that we had found from Mr. Schaffel's residence, I believe.
And so if today is May the 3rd, which I think it is. I was just verifying that. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, time flies. May the 2nd, 2005, is the first time that you actually attempted to verify that this phone number belonged to Brad Miller. Is that correct?
That's incorrect.
When did you try to verify it before?
Well, one of my detectives has written several search warrants to various phone companies involved in this investigation. As you heard, there's thousands of numbers. We were able to determine a couple of days ago that the phone number that we believed showed linked to Brad Miller was actually linked to a subsidiary cellular phone company that fell through the cracks when we were putting everything together.
Alright, but in order to determine whose phone it is, you concluded that you can call it and find out who answers it, right?
That's exactly what I did.
And you concluded that yesterday and did that yesterday, correct?
That's what I did yesterday, yes, sir.
Alright, now, there's no question, based on your investigation at this point, that Brad Miller was a licensed private investigator, correct?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Based on your investigation, you're in charge. Back to the foundation. You're in charge of the investigation, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
And as a part of that, your responsibility is to have a working knowledge of the investigation that's conducted by officers under you, is that correct?
I have some knowledge of the investigation, yes.
And you are aware that Brad Miller is a licensed private investigator, correct?
I'm aware of that.
And you were aware long before today that Brad Miller was, in fact, working for Marc Schaffel, correct?
I'm aware of that.
Okay, and you've been aware of that for some time?
Yes, I have.
And you would have expected that Marc Schaffel and Brad Miller would have been in communication based on the fact that he's a lawyer and this was a private investigator working for him, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you called yesterday?
Yes.
Okay, no further questions.
Nothing further.
You may step down. Call your next witness.
Craig Bonner.
Do you have an exhibit number for this?
I'm trying to find out when I have the evidence.
Yes. Off-the-record discussion held at council table.
Detective Bonner, one of the assignments that you were given in this case in which you spent considerable time on the witness stand the last couple of days just testifying to phone records, correct?
That's correct.
And in the procurement of those records, did you obtain a search warrant for the telephone records of Brad Miller?
For the number that I associated with Brad Miller, yes.
Okay, and how many telephone companies was that request sent to?
Every single one, by name and his personal information.
Every single one doing business in California?
Correction, I'm sorry, correct. Basically any phone company, at wireless, all of the cell phone companies, as well as Verizon California and PacBell. Anything that I thought might have a telephone registered to Mr. Miller.
And as a result of the search warrants that were returned, did you get any information from any of those carriers that the private investigator Brad Miller had a telephone?
None of the information directly came back directly to Mr. Miller.
Now, with regard to the telephone number area code 310-490-0144, do you recognize that number?
Yes.
And was there a return on the search warrant associated with that number?
There was. It came back to a Payless reseller with an associated name, last name of like Mazafarian.
So Mr. Miller wasn't in any way, with the paperwork you've got, connected to that number?
No.
As a result of the information that Detective Klapakis was able to obtain about the person that he talked to at that number, were you asked to put together a list of phone calls that you reviewed from the exhibits 452, 456 and 450 that you had previously testified?
Yes, I did that last night.
And let me just show you the exhibit which I've shown to counsel, Your Honor, and had marked as 884 for identification purposes.
All right.
It's a 4-page document.
This is the materials I prepared last night.
That's a compilation of the telephone records that are in evidence in this case that reflect communications between that phone number, Mr. Miller's phone, and other parties in this case, correct?
That's correct.
And is that particular exhibit, 884, listed in the time in which those are? The sequence in which those phone calls are made?
Yes, it does.
And the individual names that are contained on that particular exhibit?
Do you want me to list
Just the people, yes.
The phones that are in this exhibit come back to Vincent Amen, Frank Casio, Evelyn Tavashi, MJJ Productions, and Miss, or the Hamid Mazafarian phone number that we now believe or now know comes back to Brad Miller.
Now, with regard to the document 884 that you put together, this is a digest or a compilation of the information from the exhibits I referred to, 452, 450, 456, and I believe those are the ones. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Your Honor, at this time I move this be put into evidence.
No objection, other than the previous objection.
All right, they're admitted, subject to the.
Oh, Bob? I showed you this earlier. Your Honor, I have another document. It's 885, and it's a 13-page document. I'm sorry, it's a 22-page document. And I've shown that to counsel, and I placed a blue number in the lower right-hand corner on each of the pages, 1 through 22. All right, Detective Bonner, are you familiar with the exhibit 885?
Yes, I am.
And are you familiar with the pages, or what it purports to represent of 1 through 22?
Yes.
And these are diagrams, are they not?
Yes, they are.
That reflect the information contained in exhibit 884?
Correct.
Between the parties?
Correct.
I'd move that 885 be placed into evidence, Your Honor.
No objection.
It's admitted.
Excuse me. Now, with regard to the information that's contained in the exhibit 884, okay. The source of that information is from exhibits that are in this case, correct?
Correct.
And there are no exhibits in this case that show phone calls that are. Let me rephrase that. Did you determine whether Mr. Cassio's phone was a cellular or a landline?
It's a cellular.
And Mr. Amen's?
Again, a cellular phone.
And the Tavashi phone?
It's a cellular phone.
So these are cellular phones?
Correct.
And the phone calls that are on this particular document are all cellular contacts, is that correct?
Correct.
So these would be calls that show up on the user phone, either Casio, Tavashi or Amen, correct?
Correct.
Calls either made by them to that number, 310-490-0144, or calls placed by that number to them that show up on their telephone records, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Probably to the relief of everybody, I'm not going to go through all 22 of these exhibits. I'm just going to show one on the Elmo, Your Honor, to illustrate the information that you've provided on document 884. And I'm selecting 3.
15th?
Yeah. Okay. I've just taken the one that has a 3 in the lower right-hand corner. And this has the date of March 15, 2003, on it, correct?
Correct.
And obviously the cellular phones. There's a cellular phone, 4 phones, depicted on the exhibit?
That's correct.
Now, tell the jury what the numbers that you placed on there reflect in terms of the information provided on the exhibit 884, the telephones.
Basically, there are 2 lines for each phone to each of the other phones, or, I'm sorry, from Brad Miller's phone to each of the other phones. There are directional arrows which indicate which direction the call went. And there are numbers associated with the arrows if there are any calls, and that will tell you how many calls went from each phone on that date. Starting with the top connection between the Bradley Miller phone and the Frank Cassio phone, we have 7 calls going from Cassio's phone to Miller's phone. And we have 4 calls going from Miller's phone to Cassio's phone. With regard to the other 2 phones, there's a large 0 in the center indicating there are no telephone calls to those phones.
And was this the same approach that you took to all 22 charts that were prepared?
It is.
Okay. Could we have the lights, Your Honor? All right. Let's move on to another subject. During the course of the investigation, were you assigned to review items of evidence that were seized from certain locations?
Yes, I was.
And were you assigned to review some video footage that was obtained in the residence of Mr. Hamid Moslehi?
I was for Hamid also, yes.
And did you review some footage of that was filmed between Mr. Jackson and Mr. Bashir having a conversation?
Yes, I did. I should clarify that actually came from Schaffel's residence.
Oh, okay. It came from Mr. Schaffel's residence?
Correct.
All right. So you reviewed that item?
Yes.
And what is the item number of that associated with the sheriff's investigation?
Item number 1360.
And during the course of that conversation, or during the course of the review of that, did you actually see Mr. Jackson having a conversation with Mr. Bashir?
I did.
And did the subject of flying come up during that conversation?
It did.
And during the course of that conversation between Mr. Bashir and Mr. Jackson, did you hear anything said by Mr. Jackson with regard to alcohol?
I did.
What did Mr. Jackson say?
I'll go ahead and read it from my report. I quoted it. Mr. Jackson's statement was, "You don't have, like, a little bit of Jesus juice, a little bit of wine."
Now, was there anywhere else on that video that you reviewed that the term, Jesus juice, was used by anybody else?
No.
You were also assigned the responsibility. Give me a moment. Are you familiar with an individual by the name of Louise Palanker?
Yes, I am.
How did you become familiar with Ms. Palanker?
I interviewed Miss Palanker.
Do you recall when that interview had occurred?
Not offhand. I know it was in the middle part of last year.
And was it taped?
Yes, it was.
And was that tape booked into evidence?
Yes, it was.
And did you, at my request, review that tape?
I did.
And what were you asked to review? Looking for what?
I was asked to review to find if there was any statement to the effect that Janet Arvizo had sold the kids at the comedy camp or sold the kids at the hospital.
Was the word, sold, or, seldom?
The actual word used was seldom, that Janet was seldom at the comedy camp. Janet was seldom at the hospital.
Could you spell that, please?
SELDOM.
It was not SEL, apostrophe, IM.
No.
And you reviewed the tapes and ascertained that to be correct?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay, let's start with your first topic. You had 3 topics, the first one being the cell phone records. The summary chart that was Exhibit 885 that Mr. Sneddon put up. I believe he put page 3 up on the board, the summary charts?
Right here.
With the court's permission, I could put up my copy, if that's all right.
That's fine.
And Mr. Sneddon, is this the most recent?
Nods head up and down.
Okay. I'm going to put up page 3, because that's the one that was shown as a representative. That was shown as a representative page, and there's, actually, I forgot how many pages we were told, but quite a number of pages to this, right?
20 some odd, I believe.
20 some odd pages. When was this prepared?
Last night.
And when was it delivered to defense counsel?
I didn't deliver it, but I would assume this morning.
This morning. Okay. Now, 884, may I just put up the first page of that? It would be my copy, if that's all right.
Yes.
Mr. Sneddon, this is the correct.
Fine.
All right. 884 is a several page. I think a 4-page exhibit that has the summary of all the records, correct?
Correct.
And those were faxed to my house last night by you, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, they were.
And that would have been about 7:22 in the evening?
Correct.
All right. On this summary chart, and we can have lights again, if that's all right, Your Honor. On this summary chart, you have a record of phone calls that were made to and from what you've now determined. What you've now labeled as the Bradley Miller telephone, correct?
Correct.
Maybe it would be helpful, I'm sorry to do that, but if I could put up 885, that one page again. Because on these, you've now labeled which way they were going and the number going each way, correct?
Correct.
All right, there you go. And you show 4 phones in those. That same graphic is used for each of the pages, is that right?
Correct.
That's why you have O here, because there were 0.
Correct.
On this particular date. On the other hand, this also tells us that what you were able to analyze were calls going to and from what you've labeled as the Bradley Miller telephone, to and from the Vincent Amen telephone, the Evelyn Tavashi, MJJ Prod telephone, and the Frank Cassio telephone. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, was there just one number to Evelyn Tavashi that you looked at?
That's the only number that came out.
And that is a cell phone?
Yes.
All right. Now, did you do this by analyzing just the records of the Amen, Tavashi and Cassio telephone?
We looked at every record that we have with the computer system, and these are the only 3 records that came out with any calls to that telephone.
Okay. Do you have the records for what's called the Bradley Miller phone?
We only have a 1-sheet piece of, if we're talking about toll records, no, we do not. We do have a 1-sheet page that tells us that it comes back to Hamid Mozaffarian, a cellular.
And just because we have 2 Hamids we've talked about, Hamid Mozaffarian has nothing to do with Hamid Moslehi, correct?
No.
I said, correct. I'm sorry. Let me ask the question. Does Hamid Mozaffarian have anything to do with Hamid Moslehi?
No.
Thank you. Therefore, you did not have the records from that Miller phone to see what numbers the Miller phone called, correct?
Correct.
Nor to see what incoming calls, if any, were recorded for that phone, correct?
Other than for these 3 telephones up here, no.
I'm sorry. I'm saying for the Brad Miller phone itself, right?
No, but these records do show calls to and from the Bradley Miller phone. We don't have Bradley Miller's records, though.
Thank you. That's what I was getting at. I understand you have the other records. But for Brad Miller, you have one page that showed the subscriber information. Is that correct?
Correct.
Has that page been marked as an exhibit in this case?
I don't know.
To your knowledge? Okay, alright, so therefore, let me withdraw that. The Garrigus records. You had records pertaining to the law firm of Garrigus and Garrigus, correct?
Correct.
You didn't have the toll records, did you? Did you?
I believe they were actually sent. However, we were not supposed to receive those, so we have not included those in any analysis.
Alright, because Mr. Garrigus' law firm has attorney-client privilege communications, I take it?
And more specifically in the warrant that I wrote, I laid out that we were not going to seek toll records.
Alright, and you did that because you understood that that might create a problem?
It could unless we were able to show him as being a member of a conspiracy.
Alright.
And part of the crime that occurred.
Alright, so the point being, that you did not have an opportunity to evaluate calls between Mr. Miller's phone, the one you've attributed to him, and the Garrigus law firm?
Correct.
In other words, you didn't have records going either way on that one, right?
We have records. We did not analyze them, yes.
When I say, have, did you not have them to look at and analyze in?
Correct.
Alright, and you did not have records pertaining to any cell phones that Mr. Garrigus might have, correct?
Correct. Other than subscriber records. We do see subscriber records on that also.
And when you say that, that means it just shows whose telephone number it is, right?
Correct.
So therefore, did you not have available to you to analyze records to determine any calls between Mr. Miller's phone and Mr. Garrigus' cell phone?
I'm having a slight problem with that, because we did have the records. We simply set them aside and did not use them with regard to the Garrigus records.
And that was pursuant to the court-ordered search warrant that you requested, is that correct?
Right.
So I think I used the word, have available to analyze.
I just want to clarify. They were sent, we just did not use them.
Okay, alright, so what we have here, it's not a big thing, I just want to clarify this. What we have here basically is the analysis of the other records for which there are toll records showing communications with this phone, but not any phone numbers associated with Garrigus.
Correct.
Alright, now.
Can we take a break?
That would be fine. But, Your Honor, we do need to address the court on one matter briefly before or after we take the break.
All right, let's let the jury go ahead and take their break. I'll remain a moment. Officer, you may step down. All right.
Your Honor, I know this is the 4th time, but I think you can see this coming. What's called the Hamid footage or the outtakes footage that we had asked to play.
Yes.
We now have. The government has now quoted from that footage, and therefore we would ask to play the entire statement to put those quotes in context. And I know I've asked the court before, and I don't mean to be rude.
I was just going to say, one more time, if it's the 4th time, you're keeping track.
Yes.
Not in the people's case.
Very well. I hope the court understands, there was a reason, because they quoted from it.
Well, if you could isolate out one piece that has to do with that one piece. However, you have to remember that I watched all those outtakes, and I know how many hours and how much repetition is there.
Right.
So we're not talking about something I'm not totally familiar with. And if you want to take the time to go and find the material specifically that they're relating to and show a small portion that relates to that, that's fine. But that doesn't give you license to play hours and hours of that outtake, whatever it's called.
I think it's like 2 hours and 45 minutes or something like that.
Well, it seemed like, all right.
The second one, I understand what the court said. And please, Your Honor, Understand we just learned this right now, that they were going to quote that section. So I'll have to see if I can find it and maybe do it later. The second thing I wanted to address is there's been now a quote from the Louise Palanker tape. That is a shorter tape, and I do think it would be appropriate to play that. That's her interview.
I don't see that either. It's up to, if is there anything specific you want to play, in rebuttal to what they've just put on, or if there's some reason to play the whole tape in your case, you may, but I'll have to find out what it is. But just clarifying that one word doesn't call for the playing of the whole tape.
So having moved, those are denied and we're on a break.
Yes.
Alright, thank you.